My name is Renee Castellan, and I was 19 years old when I found out my little sister had been sold a story about me that made me the villain of my own childhood. I didn't learn it from her. I learned it from a stranger, at my own sister's wedding, 12 years after I'd stopped being allowed to call myself part of that family. A woman in a blue dress touched my arm at the gift table and said, "You must be so relieved they finally forgave you." And I said, "Forgave me for what?" And she looked at me like I'd asked her to explain the sky. That's the day I found out what my mother had been telling people for over a decade. Not the truth. A story. A very good one. One where I was the reason everything broke. I'm going to tell you the real one tonight, the one that starts with a locked bedroom door when I was 15, and ends with a folder of documents I handed a judge on a Tuesday morning in March. If you have ever been the one who got blamed for surviving something, stay with me. This is for you. Welcome to Behind Closed Doors Revenge, where we tell the truths families bury under casseroles and church clothes. If this is your first time here, subscribe now, because you are going to want to be here for the ending. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's go back to Birch Hollow. I grew up in Birch Hollow, a town in central Pennsylvania small enough that the volunteer fire department doubled as the ambulance service and everybody's business belonged to everybody. My father, Walt Castellan, ran the hardware store his own father had built. My mother, Diane, ran everything else, the house, the church calendar, and, most precisely, the story of our family. There were 3 of us kids. Me, the oldest. My brother Patrick, 2 years younger. And my sister Bethany, 6 years behind me, born the year my father's store nearly went under and came back, which in my mother's telling made Bethany something like a small, personal miracle. The baby who saved us just by arriving. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the thing I had to fight hardest to hold on to in this story. My mother was not a cartoon. She sang in the choir with a voice that made grown men cry at funerals. She remembered every neighbor's chemo schedule and showed up with soup. To half of Birch Hollow, Diane Castellan was a saint with a casserole dish. At home, she ran on a different current. There was a hierarchy in our house, and I understood it the way you understand which stair creaks, not because anyone explains it, but because you learn it with your body. Patrick was funny and easy and never in trouble, so he floated. Bethany was small and loud and adored, so she was protected. And I was capable. I was the one you could hand a problem to and walk away from, certain it would get handled. By 12, I was doing the grocery shopping when my mother's migraines came on. By 14, I was the one who signed Bethany's school forms because Mom didn't have the bandwidth. I want you to notice that phrase, because it's going to matter later, didn't have the bandwidth. That was the sentence that excused everything, for years, in our house. The year I turned 15, my father's hardware store failed for real this time. Not a scare, a closure. A bank letter, then a sign in the window, then the smell of a building being emptied out, boxes and shelving sold off piece by piece to a competitor 2 towns over. My dad stopped talking much that spring. He'd sit in the garage with the radio on and a beer going warm in his hand, and none of us went out there, not even my mother. That was also the year my mother started disappearing into her bedroom for stretches that got longer as the months went on. A door that used to open for anyone now had a hook and eye lock on the inside, small, brass, the kind you'd put on a bathroom, not a bedroom in a house with 3 kids in it. I remember standing outside that door at 15, holding a stack of school papers that needed a signature, listening to nothing on the other side for so long I started to wonder if she'd left through the window. She hadn't left. She was just gone in the way people can be gone while still living in the house with you. I didn't have a word for it then. I have a lot of words for it now, most of them from a therapist's office. But at 15, all I knew was that somebody had to keep the lights on in that house, literally and otherwise, and I was the only one standing there with my hand raised. So I raised it. I made dinner most nights that year, grilled cheese, spaghetti, whatever came out of a box. I signed Bethany's field trip forms in a version of my mother's handwriting I got frighteningly good at. I walked her to the bus stop every morning because 9-year-olds shouldn't wait for a bus alone on a road with no shoulder, and nobody else was doing it. I learned to read the electric bill and I learned which drawer the checkbook lived in, and twice that year I wrote checks myself and had my father sign them without asking too many questions, because asking questions in that house had started to feel like poking something that was already bleeding. Here's what I didn't understand yet. Every time I stepped up, I wasn't earning safety. I was teaching the house a lesson it would never unlearn, that there was one person in it who could be handed anything, indefinitely, without a thank you attached. I want to tell you about one night in particular, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. It was October, I was 15, and Bethany had a fever of 103. My mother's door was locked. My father was at a men's breakfast thing he'd started going to at the church, trying to find some floor to stand on after the store closed. I called him. He didn't pick up. I called my mother's cell, which was charging on the kitchen counter 6 feet from her locked door, and I heard it buzz through the wall and go silent. I drove Bethany to urgent care myself. I was 15. I did not have a license. I had watched my father drive that same stretch of road 1,000 times and I did it anyway, hazard lights on the whole way, my hands shaking so hard I had to grip the wheel like it might come off in my hands. The nurse at check-in asked where our parents were and I told her my mom had a migraine and my dad was on his way. Both lies. I'd gotten good at lies that protected the house. Bethany had an ear infection. Nothing catastrophic. We were home by 11, and I put her to bed, and I sat on the edge of the bathtub afterward and shook for 20 minutes with the fan running so nobody would hear if I cried, which I didn't, actually, not that night. I want to be precise about that, because for years I told this story to myself with tears in it that weren't there. I didn't cry. I just sat very still and felt something close over in my chest like a door being latched. My mother came out of her room the next morning like nothing had happened, made pancakes, asked how Bethany was feeling. I told her what happened, the fever, the drive, urgent care. And my mother looked at me for a long moment and said, "Well, you handled it. You always do." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to. You always do. Not thank you. Not I'm sorry that fell to you. A closing statement. A verdict already reached, this is simply what you are for. I need to fast forward through 2 years here, not because they don't matter, but because they were mostly more of the same, turned up slightly louder each season, my mother's door staying shut longer, my father drinking a little earlier in the evening, me running a household I hadn't agreed to run, and Bethany, sweet and oblivious, growing up in a version of our house that looked nothing like the one I was living in. She had a mother who made her lunch and came to her recitals. I had a mother who called me capable and meant it as a discharge form. By the time I was 17, something had shifted, and it took me a long time to understand what. My mother had started seeing a counselor, a real one, through the church's referral network, a woman named Dr. Okafor who I will always be grateful to, even though what happened next hurt me more than almost anything else in this story. Because here's the thing nobody warns you about family therapy that doesn't include the whole family. It can heal one person by giving them a story that requires someone else to be the wound. My mother came out of those months of counseling with language. Words like boundaries and enabling and codependent, which are good words, real words, words that have helped a lot of people. And she turned them, with what I now understand was not malice exactly, but a kind of desperate need to make sense of her own life, onto me. The story became this: my mother had struggled with depression for years, true, and during that time, I had stepped into a parentified role, true, though I'd have called it something else at 15, something more like nobody else was standing there, and this parentification, my mother now said, had been unhealthy for the whole family. She explained to me one evening at the kitchen table, her voice gentle and rehearsed in a way I'd learned to recognize, taken over in ways that had undermined her authority and made it harder for her to parent. I was 17 years old, and my mother sat across from me and explained, with the calm authority of someone quoting a professional, that the reason our house had struggled was, in part, me. That my competence had been a problem. That I had, without meaning to, made myself indispensable in a way that wasn't fair to Bethany, who deserved a mother, not a sister acting like one. I remember not being able to speak for a full minute. I remember doing the math in my head, 15, the locked door, the fever, the drive I wasn't licensed to make, and trying to find the version of events where that was me taking over rather than me being left. I couldn't find it. But my mother said it with such settled certainty, and Dr. Okafor's name attached to it gave it a kind of institutional weight, that I started to doubt my own memory instead of hers. That's what a competent retelling does to a quiet witness. It doesn't argue with your version. It simply replaces it, calmly, in front of you, while you're still holding the old one in your hands like something you now have to be embarrassed about. From that point on, something in our house recalibrated. My mother started stepping back into rooms I had run for 2 years, the grocery list, Bethany's school forms, dinner, not gradually, but pointedly, almost performatively, as if to demonstrate a mother reclaiming her rightful place. And every time she did, she'd say some version of the same thing to Bethany, in front of me, "Mommy's got it now, sweetheart. Renee doesn't have to carry everything." You'd think that would have felt like relief. Some of it did. But underneath the relief was something colder, and it took me years to name it. I had gone, in the space of one dinner table conversation, from the person who held the house up to the reason the house had been unsteady in the first place. My competence had been quietly rewritten from a sacrifice into a symptom. And once a story like that exists in a house, it doesn't stay contained to one conversation. It spreads. It becomes the water everyone breathes. By the time I left for community college 2 towns over, I couldn't afford to go farther, and frankly, by then, I didn't want to. The story had fully set. I was, in the family's now settled account, the daughter who had struggled to let go of control. Who had, in some unspoken way, needed the family to need her. Patrick, who by then had drifted into a friend group that worried me and a habit of borrowing money he didn't pay back, was framed as finding his way. Bethany, 11 years old and thriving in the sudden light of 2 present parents, was simply Bethany, untouched, unquestioned, the proof that the family had healed. I want to tell you about the specific afternoon the story calcified into something I couldn't argue with anymore, because it's the moment that explains everything that happened years later. I was 18, home for a weekend from school, and my mother had invited her sister, my Aunt Carla, over for coffee. I came downstairs for water and heard my name in the kitchen, so I stopped in the hallway the way you do when you hear your name and some animal part of you needs to know what's being said about you before you're seen. My mother was telling Aunt Carla, in a voice thick with something that sounded almost like grief, about how hard those years were, about how Renee had really struggled to find her role once I started getting better, about how she worried I'd always resent the family a little for not needing me the way I needed to be needed. I stood in that hallway and felt the floor tilt. Because in that version, the version now being handed to my mother's own sister, who would carry it to Thanksgiving, to the next baby shower, to the next 15 years of family gatherings, I wasn't the 15-year-old who drove her sick sister to urgent care without a license because no one else would answer the phone. I was a girl who had struggled to give up power. A girl whose problem was that she'd wanted, too badly, to be indispensable. I didn't confront her that day. I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you are waiting for the moment I finally said something, and it isn't this one. I was 18, and I had just heard my own rescue reframed as my own dysfunction, in my mother's voice, to a woman who would repeat it verbatim for a decade. I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of my childhood bed, and did the same thing I'd done that night after urgent care 3 years earlier. I went very still. I didn't cry. I just felt something close over. Midpoint marker, invite engagement. If you've ever heard your own sacrifice described back to you as a character flaw, I want you to comment one word below, just one, so I know how many of us are sitting with this tonight. And if this is landing for you, go ahead and subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where the story my mother built finally meets the truth, 12 years later, in a room she didn't choose. I finished my associate's degree working 2 jobs, transferred to a 4-year state school on loans and a partial scholarship, and built, slowly and without much drama, a life that had almost nothing to do with Birch Hollow. I studied logistics and supply chain management, which sounds unglamorous, and it is, mostly, except that it turned out I had a genuine talent for looking at a broken system and figuring out the 11 steps between chaos and order, which, if you've been listening carefully, should not surprise you at all. I had been doing exactly that since I was 15 years old. I'd just never been paid for it, or thanked for it, until now. I went home for holidays for a while, dutifully, the way you do when you haven't yet decided the distance is permanent. Each visit, the story about me had aged a little further into settled fact. My mother would introduce me to new people at church potlucks with a warm hand on my shoulder and a line that always landed the same way. "This is Renee, she went through a rough patch finding her independence, but we're so close now." I'd stand there and smile, because contradicting it in front of a stranger holding a plate of deviled eggs felt like a fight I couldn't win in that room, on that day, with that audience. Patrick's life, in the meantime, was quietly falling apart in ways the family had a remarkable capacity not to see. 2 DUIs by 24. A marriage that ended after 18 months. Money that went missing from my parents more than once, always explained away, a loan, a rough patch. Boys will struggle before they find themselves. I want to be careful here, because addiction is a disease, and I don't say any of this to condemn my brother. I say it because the family's willingness to explain away Patrick's chaos, while treating my competence as a character defect, is the clearest measurement I have of how the story worked. Struggling sons got grace. A daughter who'd held the house up at 15 got a diagnosis. Bethany grew up sweet and a little sheltered, adored in the specific, uncomplicated way that youngest children sometimes are when the family has decided its hard years are over. She and I were never close, not because of anything either of us did, but because we were, functionally, raised by different families in the same house. She got the parents who showed up, I got the ones who were learning to. I moved to Columbus after college for a job with a regional distribution company, and the distance did something for me that Birch Hollow never could. It let me build a version of my own history that wasn't constantly being edited by someone else in the next room. I dated. I made friends who'd never heard the phrase rough patch finding her independence and had no context to receive it as anything but strange. I went to therapy, real therapy, my own choosing, not a referral filtered through my mother's version of events, and a counselor named Yusuf helped me do something I hadn't done in over a decade, lay the actual timeline of my childhood next to the story my family told about it, side by side, and look at the gap. The gap was not small. By 26, I was running warehouse operations for 3 distribution centers across Ohio. By 29, I'd started my own consulting practice helping mid-size logistics companies fix exactly the kind of broken systems I'd apparently been training my whole life to see. It grew faster than I expected. I hired my first employee at 30, a sharp, funny woman named Priya who became, over the following years, something closer to family than most of my actual family, the kind of person who shows up with soup when you're sick and doesn't need to be asked and doesn't tell the story about it to anyone afterward. I went home less. Then almost never. My mother would call, our conversations warm and shallow, always circling back to some version of "we wish you'd come around more," never once circling back to why I might not want to. I sent cards. I sent money once, when my father's knee surgery ran over budget, quietly, directly to the surgical center, the way I would learn, much later, to always do things, cleanly, on paper, with no room left for anyone to retell it later as something it wasn't. I did not go to Patrick's second wedding. I did go to Bethany's, 12 years after that October night with the fever, because she was my sister, because some stubborn hope in me kept believing that enough time might have quietly repaired what needed repairing, the way time sometimes does, if you let it. It hadn't. It had done the opposite. It had let the story finish hardening into something nobody in that family had questioned in over a decade. The wedding was in a restored barn 40 minutes outside Birch Hollow, string lights and mason jars and a band that played mostly covers. I'd flown in the night before, stayed at a hotel instead of my parents' house, a small boundary I'd started keeping without fully articulating why, until Yusuf helped me name it. I no longer wanted to sleep under a roof where the story about me lived in every room. I found Bethany radiant in the getting ready suite, and for a moment, watching her fix her sister-in-law's hair clip in a mirror, I felt something soften in me that had been braced for years. She hugged me hard and said she was so glad I came, and I believed her, and I believe her still. Whatever else is true in this story, Bethany's affection for me, then and now, was never the problem. She'd simply never been given the raw material to know there was a problem at all. The ceremony was lovely. I cried at the right parts, the normal parts, the parts everyone cries at. I want you to know that, because so much of what I'm about to tell you is heavy, and I don't want you to think the whole day was a trap. Some of it was just my sister getting married, and it was beautiful, and I was glad to be there for that part of it. It was at the gift table, an hour into the reception, that a woman in a blue dress, I never did learn her name, and I've thought about that a lot since, touched my forearm while I was setting down a card and said, warmly, like she was handing me a compliment, "You must be so relieved they finally forgave you." I said, "Forgave me for what?" And she blinked, confused by my confusion, the way you'd be confused if someone asked you to explain that water was wet. "Oh, I just mean, your mom's told us so much about those years. How hard it was, how you struggled to really let the family heal after everything. It's just so nice to see you all together now." She smiled like she'd said something kind. In her mind, she had. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment, because I think some of you know exactly what I mean. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific, physical sensation of realizing that a story about your own life has been circulating for years in rooms you were never in, told by someone who was there for none of the parts that actually happened, and that this story has, by now, been believed by more people than have ever heard your version, because you were never given the microphone to tell it. I smiled at her, said something forgettable, and walked to the edge of the barn, out into the parking lot, where I stood by a stranger's truck and did the thing I'd apparently trained myself to do at 15 and never stopped doing. I went very still. I did not cry. I felt something close over. But this time, something else happened too, something new. Underneath the closing over, for the first time in 29 years, I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't shame. I felt clarity. Because I finally understood that I was not fighting a memory anymore. I was fighting a documented, decade-long, actively maintained narrative, one my mother had built consciously, told deliberately, and updated as needed, to an entire community of people who would now, without a shred of malice on their own part, greet me for the rest of my life as a redeemed problem instead of a person who had once, as a child, held a house together with her bare hands and been punished for the calluses. I went back inside. I danced with my father, who held my hands a little too tightly and said, "You look just like your mother did at your age," which I did not know how to take and still don't. I hugged Bethany goodbye. And I drove back to my hotel that night and didn't sleep, because somewhere around 1 a.m., lying in the dark with my phone lighting up my face, I had started making a list. Not a list of grievances. I'd had that list, mentally, for years. This was a different list. This was a list of proof. Here is something I want to tell you plainly, because it matters for what comes next. I am not, by nature, a person who keeps receipts out of spite. What I kept because somewhere around 22, in a therapy session I almost cancelled, Yusuf had asked me a question that rearranged something in me permanently. He'd asked, if someone ever needed to verify what actually happened to you, what would you be able to show them? At the time, I couldn't answer. I had memory, and memory, I was learning the hard way, loses every argument against a confident, well-told story. So I started, quietly, almost as a private act of self-respect rather than any plan for confrontation, keeping things. I still had the urgent care intake form from the night I was 15, parents unavailable listed in a box, my own signature where a guardian's should have been, because the on-call physician, God bless her, had let a panicked 15-year-old sign for her sick sister rather than turn them away. I'd kept it in a box of school papers for no reason I could articulate at 17 and every reason I understood at 29. I had the counseling referral paperwork from when my mother started seeing Dr. Okafor, because for a strange, brief period when I was 18, in a fit of trying to understand what was happening to my own story, I had actually called that office and asked, as the eldest child, whether family sessions might help. I was told, politely, that Diane had specified individual sessions only. I had that voicemail forwarded to my email, still, 11 years later, an artifact I hadn't understood the value of until that night in the hotel. I had bank records, my own, showing 3 separate wire transfers directly to medical providers over the years: my father's knee surgery, a dental emergency for Bethany when she was 14 and my parents were between insurance plans, a plumbing repair the winter their basement flooded, and Patrick, predictably, didn't have anything to contribute. None of these had ever been mentioned by my mother, not once, in any retelling of our family to anyone. In her version, I was the daughter who'd pulled away. In mine, documented and dated, I was the daughter who'd never stopped quietly holding the floor up, long after I'd been told my competence was the problem. And I had one more thing, the thing that mattered most, the thing I hadn't looked at in almost a decade because it hurt too much to look at, a folder, physical, cardboard, that I'd taken from my childhood bedroom the last time I helped my parents clean it out for a home office. Inside were report cards from when I was 15 and 16, grades that had dipped hard that year and never fully recovered, a permanent, quiet casualty nobody in my family had ever once connected to what was happening at home. A note from a school counselor, Mrs. Delgado, dated that October, asking my mother to come in for a meeting about my sudden change in performance and apparent exhaustion. A meeting my mother never attended. I know because the follow-up note, 3 weeks later, said as much, in the specific, careful language school administrators use when they suspect something they can't prove. Please advise if a home visit would be more convenient. Nobody ever called Mrs. Delgado back. I found that out at 29, in a hotel room, reading a letter that had been sitting in a box for 14 years, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that there had been a documented, institutional record, a teacher, a form, a date, of a child in visible distress, and an invitation for someone to intervene, and that invitation had simply gone unanswered, and then, years later, that same child's distress had been quietly renamed as her unwillingness to let go of control. I sat on that hotel bed and I did not cry, not really, but something in my chest that had been shut for 14 years came loose, slow and heavy, like a door swelled shut by weather finally giving way. I called Priya the next morning, my employee, my friend, and I told her I needed a week. She didn't ask why, just said, "Take it. I've got the warehouse audit covered." That's the kind of person I'd built a life around, in the years since Birch Hollow, people who didn't need the whole story to hand you what you needed. I called an attorney the following Monday. Not for a lawsuit, I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are waiting for a courtroom, and there is one, but it's not what you think. I called her because I needed to know, factually, whether what I'd just realized had happened to me, a documented pattern of childhood caregiving, unacknowledged distress with an institutional record, and a family narrative that had actively rewritten it for over a decade, had any bearing on something that had, up until that point, felt entirely separate from all of it, my father's estate planning. Here's the part one haven't told you yet, and it changes the shape of everything. My father had a stroke 8 months after Bethany's wedding. Not fatal, but significant. His left side weakened, his speech slowed, and suddenly, at 66, the man who'd run a hardware store and then said almost nothing for the next 20 years found himself needing help with things he'd never needed help with before. And in the scramble that followed, my mother, quietly and without much discussion, began positioning herself as the sole decision-maker for both of their affairs, a power of attorney, a revised will, updates to the house deed, all handled, as she put it in a group text to the 3 of us, so nobody has to worry about the details. Patrick didn't ask questions. He never did. Bethany, newly married and building her own life, trusted our mother completely, because why wouldn't she? She'd never had a single reason not to. I asked questions. Quietly, at first, then less quietly, because something about the speed of it, the way documents were being drawn up within weeks of a stroke that had clearly left my father less capable of scrutinizing anything closely, didn't sit right with the part of me that had spent a career learning to see the 11 steps of a system before it broke. I flew home. Not to my parents' house, to a hotel again, the boundary holding, and I asked to see my father alone, which my mother resisted, gently but firmly, for reasons she framed as protecting his energy. I insisted. And in a quiet visiting room at the rehabilitation facility, with his left hand resting still in his lap and his words coming slow but clear, my father told me something that finally, fully, broke the story open. He told me my mother had been managing their finances alone for years, not because she was better at it, but because he'd stopped fighting her about it after the store closed, worn down in a way he was only now, slowly, starting to name to himself in rehab, with a physical therapist who'd asked him, gently, whether he felt like he had a say in his own life. He told me that money he'd thought had gone toward Patrick's rough patches over the years, thousands of dollars, repeatedly, had, according to bank statements he'd only recently started actually reading again, in several instances gone somewhere else entirely, a private account in my mother's name alone, one he hadn't known existed until his stroke forced him to finally ask someone to read his own financial documents out loud to him. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you my mother was a criminal mastermind. I don't believe that, and I don't think it would even be accurate. I think my mother was a woman who had been pulled out of her own life at some point long before I was born. I never did find out the specifics, and I'm not sure they matter, who had built, brick by brick, a version of control that let her feel safe, and who had, over decades, quietly rerouted both money and blame in whatever direction kept that control intact. The blame had gone to me, because I was the child who'd once made her feel replaceable. The money, it turned out, had gone toward her, because control, when it curdles long enough, often ends up looking exactly like that. My father asked me, in that quiet room, to help him understand his own finances. Not to fight my mother. Not for revenge. He said, slow and careful with the words the stroke had made harder to reach, I want to know what's actually mine before anybody decides for me again. That sentence undid me more than anything else in this entire story, more than the woman in the blue dress, more than the report card in the cardboard box. Because I recognized it instantly. It was the sentence of someone finally, at 66, asking the question I had been forced to ask, silently, at 15, does anyone actually see what's happening to me, or am I just going to be handled? I hired a forensic accountant, a careful, unhurried woman named Denise who'd spent 20 years untangling exactly this kind of quiet, decades-long financial fog. It took her 6 weeks to build a clear picture, over 11 years, roughly $91,000 that my father believed had gone to household costs, medical bills, and help for Patrick had instead moved, in smaller increments designed not to draw attention, into an account solely in my mother's name, money that, under Pennsylvania law, given the marital assets involved and my father's diminished capacity to have consented knowingly to recent transfers, represented a serious problem for any estate or power of attorney arrangement built on top of it. I didn't bring this to my mother in a kitchen. I brought it, with my father's full knowledge and at his explicit request, to an elder law attorney, who filed a petition to review the power of attorney my mother had drawn up 8 months earlier, on the grounds of both the financial findings and reasonable concern about my father's capacity to have consented to it in the state he was in when he signed. The hearing was in a small courtroom in the county seat, unremarkable, fluorescent lit, nothing like the dramatic courtrooms you see on television. My mother arrived in her good church coat, composed, ready. I recognized the posture immediately, because I'd watched her walk into rooms like that my whole life, prepared to be the most reasonable, most sympathetic person present. For the first time in 29 years, though, the room wasn't one she controlled the story in. Denise's report was entered as evidence, clean and dated and impossible to narrate around. My father, seated beside his own attorney, not my mother's, a detail that visibly startled her when she saw the arrangement, gave a short statement, slow but steady, saying only that he wanted his own finances managed by someone accountable to him, and that he no longer felt confident that person was his wife. My mother's attorney tried, gently, to raise the old story, my history, my difficult relationship with control in the family, the language of a decade of dinner table therapy repurposed now for a judge instead of an and over coffee. And for one long moment, sitting in the gallery, I felt the old vertigo rise in me, the fear that the story would work here too, the way it had worked everywhere else for so long. But a judge is not an ant at a coffee table. A judge does not need a redemption arc. A judge needs documents, and I had documents, going back 14 years, that no amount of confident retelling could rewrite in front of her. The urgent care form. The unanswered note from Mrs. Delgado. Denise's careful accounting of 11 years of money moving quietly in one direction. None of it needed me to cry to be believed. It simply needed to be read. The judge did not restore the power of attorney to my mother. She appointed a neutral, court-monitored arrangement instead, with my father's explicit input built into every decision, and ordered a full accounting of the funds in question, with repayment terms to follow. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped. My mother did not stand up and confess anything, then or ever. Some people, I've learned, never do, and you have to learn to let the paperwork be the apology you were never going to get in words. She simply sat very still, in her good coat, and I watched something in her posture I'd never seen before, the specific stillness of a person whose story had, for the first time in her life, stopped being enough. I didn't go to her afterward. I didn't need to say the sentence I'd once imagined saying, "This is what you did to me," because for once, I didn't have to say it. It had been said, in a courtroom, by a stranger with a folder, in a language my family had never once been willing to speak in our own kitchen. Fact. My father moved into a small apartment near mine in Columbus 4 months later, closer to his physical therapy, closer to me. Bethany, once she finally read the accountant's report herself, I gave her every page, unedited, and let her draw her own conclusions, because she deserved that, and because I was done being the only one who carried the whole truth alone, called me crying, not performing, just crying, and said, "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know." I believe her. I've told you already, she was never the problem. She'd just never been handed anything but the story. Patrick and I are still working on it. Some repairs take longer, and I've stopped needing them to move at the speed of my own patience. My mother and I speak rarely, briefly, and without warmth, which I used to think would feel like grief and mostly just feels like weather, something true about the current season, not a verdict on the rest of my life. I framed one thing, in the end, and hung it in my office, next to a photo of my first warehouse team. It's not the courtroom order. It's Mrs. Delgado's letter, the one from when I was 15, the one nobody answered. Please advise if a home visit would be more convenient, because it's the truest document I own. Proof, in a stranger's careful handwriting, dated and filed years before anyone in my family had a story ready, that what happened to me happened. That I didn't invent it. That I don't need anyone's permission, anymore, to remember it correctly. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 15, sitting alone in a bathroom with the fan running, certain I had to hold everything up by myself and be quiet about the cost of it. Being capable is not a character flaw, no matter how many times someone needs it to be one to keep their own story standing. If you gave a family more than a child should ever have to give, and they handed you back a diagnosis instead of a thank you, I want you to hear this clearly, that was never about what was wrong with you. That was about what they needed to be true about themselves. Keep your documents. Keep your dates. Keep the letters nobody answered. Someday, you may not need them for a courtroom. You may only need them for yourself, on a night when the old story tries to talk louder than the truth. That's my story tonight. If it found you, I hope it found you gently. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever rewritten your survival into your flaw? I read every single one. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, and I'll see you soon.